Welcome to this Dorothy Garrod seminar series. We'll be starting shortly, but we are just going to wait a little longer for the room to fill up with some more audience members. Welcome everyone. If you're just joining us, we'll just wait. We're just going to wait maybe 1 or 2 minutes more to let people come into the room before we start the session. But this is the Dorothy Garrod Seminar Series event today. All right, welcome all to this 7th session of our Lent term Dorothy Garrod Seminar Series at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge. If you're joining us for the first time, this term series is titled The North Atlantic Highway, Materiality and Mobilities Throughout Europe, Africa, and the Americas. And it aims to center the North Atlantic as a binding force that has permitted a diverse array of mobilities and immobilities across time, resulting in the complex cultural mosaic of the present-day North Atlantic world. Our series is framed around the different perspectives of the circum-Atlantic and invites scholars discussing the following regions: the Atlantic Americas and the Caribbean, the Atlantic Africa, and Atlantic Europe. My name is Oliver Antjak, and I am a third-year PhD student co-organizing this series with Dr. Joshua Fitzgerald, and it's my pleasure to introduce you today to our speaker, Professor Audrey Horning, to discuss Atlantic Europe with a presentation titled Dissonance and Convergence in the North Atlantic, Ireland and the Archaeology of European Expansion. But before I turn over to introduce our speaker, there are just a few housekeeping points to go over. So today's talk will last about an hour and will be followed by a 30-minute question and answer session led by my co-organizer, Dr. Fitzgerald. Please keep your microphone turned off. The chat will be disabled during the presentation, but we will turn the chat on again during the Q&A. The event will be recorded, so please keep that in mind and keep your cameras on or off as you prefer. But by remaining in the room as we record the meeting, you consent to be recorded, and the recording will eventually be available on the YouTube website, which you can access via the chat, where we'll share a link in a second. During the Q&A, if you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function to send a message to the general chat or to me or Josh personally, or you can raise your hand and we will call on you and you can unmute yourself. Captioning has been enabled for the event. If you would like to have it selected, you can press on captioning on the bottom of your screen, but they're provided and automatically generated by Zoom, so we can't be responsible for the accuracy, and you'll be able to revisit the event on YouTube if anything is unclear. We are doing our best to provide an inclusive environment in this online event, so it goes without saying that all attendees are expected to show respect and courtesy to the speakers and to each other throughout the event. And now, with that out of the way, it's my great honor to introduce you to our distinguished speaker, Professor Audrey Horning. Audrey Horning is the Forrest D. Murden Jr. Professor of Anthropology at William and Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia, and Professor of Archaeology at Queen's University, Belfast, where she's also a fellow in the Senator George J. Mitchell Institute for Global Peace, Security, and Justice. Her research centers on comparative colonialism and the relationship between archaeology and contemporary identity, with a focus upon the Atlantic world. Her publications, 8 books and over 70 journal articles and book chapters, address topics including the comparative archaeology of British expansion in Ireland and the Chesapeake, late medieval Gaelic Irish rural settlement, the role of archaeology in conflict transformation and peace building, the present and future of global historical archaeology, early modern material culture studies, the anthropology of drinking, and for something a little bit different, the 20th century archaeology of Appalachia. She is co-editor of the Cambridge journal Archaeological Dialogues, associate editor of Current Anthropology, and associate editor of the journal Historical Archaeology. She has directed fieldwork projects on both sides of the Atlantic, including Jamestown, Virginia, and a wide range of Irish sites, and currently is exploring the landscape and archive associated with the worshipful company of drapers and their early 17th century Ulster Plantation settlement. And with that, Professor Horning, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me just go ahead and try and share my screen. And hopefully that is a PowerPoint up there for you. So hello everyone, and thanks very much to Josh and Oliver for the invitation to contribute to the seminar series. I'm hoping to extend the conversations that have been happening already this semester by considering the role of Ireland in early modern European expansion. So we've spent a lot of time looking at the Caribbean and looking at, particularly looking at the west coast of Africa. I've chosen to call this talk Dissonance and Convergence in relation to looking at the character of cultural relations on the island of Ireland in the broader context of Atlantic colonialism. So as I mentioned, we've spent a lot of time focusing on the Caribbean and the coast of Africa and the connections and the connectivities between them. In moving on to Ireland, I want to continue that theme of maritime materialities, but just heading a bit further north. So I'm going to start by talking about the relationship between England and Ireland in the late medieval period. I want to spend a lot of time actually looking at Gaelic life in particular, especially in relationship to maritime adaptations. And then I'm going to spend a fair amount of time in the early 17th century looking at the ways in which incoming English and Scots engage in various different ways with Irish practices on the ground. And I hope that in doing that, it'll contribute to larger conversations that we've been having in the series about hybrid identities, the emergence of hybrid identities, the ambiguities intended on those, and also processes of mimesis. So at the end, while I'll spend most of my time in the early 17th century, I will have just a few reflections on the role of Ireland, the way that Ireland becomes fully enmeshed ultimately in the Atlantic slave trade. So we all know the story, I think. A very simple narrative is often at the heart of popular understandings of the relationship between Ireland and England. 800 years of British oppression, beginning with the Anglo-Normans in the 12th century and carrying on through the 16th and 17th century plantations up to and including the inclusion of Ireland within the United Kingdom and the British Empire, and then into the changes that we're very familiar with in the 20th century and the legacies that we still deal with in the 21st century. So very straight, simple narrative, and a narrative that has been particularly influential, I would say, on historians on the other side of the Atlantic. And that particularly in considering the relationship between England and Ireland in the 16th and into the 17th century. And the way that it goes, you can see Alison Games's words here. Colonial historians often think of Ireland as a formative place in shaping English plantations in America. So basically, what the English are doing in Ireland in the 16th and early 17th century is effectively a dress rehearsal for the real thing. So they try all these colonial tactics out on the island of Ireland in the 16th century, figure out what works, and then go and apply it successfully in North America. Hopefully you can hear from my voice that I'm not wholly convinced that that model is in fact the most accurate, and it's one that I want to spend some time taking apart. Before I do that, just a bit of background, because I don't imagine that everybody has the history of Ireland imprinted on your brains. In the 16th century, there's an English presence in Ireland, obviously from the Anglo-Norman period onwards. But the 16th century, Ireland becomes much more significant to England because England is going through the Protestant Reformation. England's greatest enemy is, of course, Spain, and Catholic Ireland on the doorstep is seen quite rightfully as a threat. So efforts to try to subdue and exert more power over Ireland begin with a sort of hearts and minds approach. So that involves trying to convert people to Protestantism, which doesn't go over particularly well. And then another effort is planting plantations, and plantations in this context, plantations of people, so colonies. So in the 16th century, there are some in the Midlands here in counties Laois and Offaly. The latter part of the 16th century, the Munster plantation on all these discontiguous bits of land, principally in counties Limerick, Cork, and a bit of Clare. In the 17th century, at the top of the island, there you can see is the Ulster Plantation in the 17th century, which is a far more all-encompassing and colonial effort. So start with hearts and minds, then move on to influencing through settlements, and then it evolves into all-out warfare. And that all-out warfare is what sets the stage essentially for what happens in the early 17th century. This is not a book plug, even though it probably looks that way. This is really just to say that the connections between Ireland and North American colonization are things that I've thought about a lot. And this particular book, I wanted to sort of analyze that notion of Ireland as a model. And to basically tell you what's in the book so you don't have to buy it, the bottom line is Ireland was not a very successful model for New World colonization. To start with, Ireland is a very different kind of place. It was not at all unknown to the English. It's not exactly far away. There was no successful colonization in the 16th century in Ireland to use as a model. So we can throw that away, but what we can't throw away is the recognition that a lot of the same people were engaged on both sides of the Atlantic. A lot of the most well-known Elizabethan adventurers, your Walter Raleighs, your Sir Francis Drake, et cetera, Gilbert, so on and so forth. So there is an involvement of similar people and similar ideology in both places. What is more interesting, I think, is that while there may be a shared colonial ideology, it plays out very differently in different places because of the different contexts. And again, as I mentioned at the start, allows us to look into the notion of hybridity and mimesis. So I won't spend much time this afternoon looking at the North American side of this particular story, because I want to delve in a bit more deeply on the Irish side of the Atlantic. And I'm going to start by looking at the nature of political divisions and society in late medieval Ireland. So if you can see on that map there, I think one thing that it should tell you is that there is no unified country called Ireland at this point in time. So we all know the discussion of nationalism is something we can push really into the 18th and 19th century, and that is very true for Ireland. So when you have this sort of simplified narratives about Ireland versus England in the 16th century, it doesn't really work. What you have is a whole series of competing lordships. You do have the area around Dublin, known as the Pale, which is still under crown control. But outside of the Pale, you have a whole series of powerful lordships, some of which are associated with the people who are now called Old English, and they are the descendants of the Anglo-Normans in the 12th century. So Josh's ancestors there. And then the other lordships are Gaelic lordships. Okay, so you can see some are large, some are small, none of them are unified, and they're all in competition one way or the other with each other. If we look into the economy, the sort of traditional understanding of Gaelic Ireland in particular is that it is pastoral, that the primary wealth is cattle. And there is truth to that. You can see it in Jobson's descriptions here from 1598. Cattle were a very, very important part of the Gaelic economy. But one of the other very important parts that is overlooked is the maritime economy. So there are very powerful maritime lordships sprinkled all around the coastline of Ireland at this point in time. And I find it quite interesting, and I actually want to thank Josh and Oliver for making me think more about that maritime aspect because of the theme of this seminar series, that the maritime power that the individual Gaelic lordships had is something that has sort of fallen by the wayside in our understanding of late medieval Ireland, mainly because it, to some extent, was not in the interest of the English to portray Ireland as having this very, very connected series of engagements far beyond the shores of Ireland itself. So I'm going to take a quick scoot around the island and introduce a few of the particularly important Gaelic lordships. So we've headed to the west, to the province of Connacht. And if we look down the coastline at Connacht, we have the O'Flahertys, and the O'Flahertys, while you head west in Ireland on holidays or whatever these days, and it's wild, it's empty, it's where everybody wants to have a holiday home, it was actually a very connected place in the past. So the O'Flahertys were quite, they were engaged with the trade that was going in and out of Galway, and Galway is essentially, there's Galway Bay there, and they're engaging with the Old English families in that settlement, and they are essentially controlling the movement of goods from the interior of this part of Ireland, namely commodities. It's going to be obviously related to cattle, but also timber and also cloth are going through the O'Flahertys and then out through Galway. If we move further north, to the OMalley lordship in County Mayo. This is probably familiar to at least some folks here, because the O'Malleys are quite a storied lordship, because when England's Queen Elizabeth was in power, she engaged quite a bit with Granuaile, or Grace O'Malley, who has been, lots of children's books about Grace the Pirate Queen. What she was a very powerful female leader of the O'Malley lordship. And she operated a series of tower houses that you see here, which are overlooking aspects of maritime shipping, and therefore controlling whose ships are coming in. And those ships are going to be obviously from elsewhere in Ireland, they're going to be from England, but they're also going to be from numerous places on the continent, okay, and extracting fees from these ships, as well as engaging in fishing, commercial fishing. Granuaile was, as I said, a very strategic individual. So her first husband was an O'Flaherty. So she brings in some of the O'Flaherty power under her own auspices. And then when her O'Flaherty husband leaves this earth, she then marries into the Burkes. So they're an Old English lordship that are adjacent, but they are also operating in a similar manner. So she becomes a very, very powerful person, and that power is very much linked on control over maritime trade. Heading down to the coast of Cork, West Cork coast, there are a couple of very important lordships here. The O'Sullivan Bears, who Colin Breen has researched quite extensively, were highly organized in the way that they basically were extracting fees from Spanish and French fishing fleets. And if you didn't pay the fees, you would definitely regret it. So they were in many ways highly bureaucratic in their engagements. And that those continental engagements are very clear in the archaeology and sites that Colin has explored, because of the presence of things, there's Chinese porcelain, for example, and there's a range of French and Spanish ceramics. The O'Driscolls, who I've pointed out on the slide there, have been explored extensively by Connie Kelleher, and they also essentially were following the same models, the O'Sullivan Bears, of extracting fees and also running their own fishing fleets. So this is quite a lucrative business. And this is a lucrative business that obviously, as England is attempting to exert its power over Ireland, it's dangerous because, of course, there are Spanish fishing fleets in this area, and the O'Driscolls and the O'Sullivan Bear are very, obviously very close with them and very closely connected and entangled. Connie continued looking at the O'Driscolls into the 17th century, and in a wonderful book, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it, The Alliance of Pirates. She looks at the ways in which that part of West Cork becomes very much entangled with a very large area across the Atlantic through piracy and through what she has called an alliance of pirates. She draws together archaeological evidence, Caribbean coconuts, for example, from a West Cork shipwreck, but also the movement of people from many different countries converging on a place like West Cork. And when you look around the coastline there are all kinds of landing places, hidden steps, caves that are part of the involvement of this part of West Cork in this illicit trading zone. I suspect, and as does Connie, that this is happening in other parts of Ireland as well. We just have not looked at the evidence closely enough yet. So moving further north, hopefully you can see on either side of the map there, on the one side you have Scotland and the other side you have Ireland, because of the proximity of the two places. So I took that photograph from a boat sailing from Ballycastle in County Antrim, heading towards Colonsay in the Inner Hebrides. So you can see both places at the same time, and that really is a lot of the story of the maritime lordships in the north of the island at this point in time. So just to give you an aerial view of the proximity of the north of Ireland to the Scottish Isles. And of course, in the medieval period, this whole area was part of the Lordship of the Isles, which was essentially ruled from the island of Islay. At the time period that I'm looking at today, the 16th century, there is no more formal Lordship of the Isles, but you do have the McDonalds who laid claim to that lordship, and they have lands both in Islay and on the north coast of County Antrim. So they are an extremely powerful lordship with connections both to Scotland and to the north of Ireland. And McDonald's will come up later in my discussion. Fairly recent research by Mark Gardner and Tom McNeil, they have focused on trying to basically counter the narrative that Ulster, as a place which had very few towns in this period compared to the rest of Ireland, really have basically, Carrickfergus and Newry are the most significant towns. What they have done is, in thinking about the role of the maritime world and the lordship, sort of turn things on their head. And instead of looking for, urban expansion, it's recognizing, as is very clear on the underlying map here, which I hope you can see, that, that there's an awful lot of activity along the coastline, not so much on the interior. And that is very much connected to the activities of a series of very powerful lordships. So Mark and Tom also went all along the coastline and have been surveying and making note of landing places. Again, similar to what Connie found for West Cork. These are not, they're not obvious harbors, but they would have been useful enough for the kinds of ships that were being sailed at that time. So these are Berlins or small galleys. We're not talking large sail ships, we're talking quite maneuverable smaller ships that can land in a lot of places that to us may seem, unlikely. One of the more powerful maritime lordships is the MacSweeney Doe, and they are actually of Scottish Gaelic derivation, who then move into the northern part of Donegal. In the 16th century, they actually become sort of a subsidiary lordship to that of the O'Donnells. The O'Donnells are actually an interior lordship, but by being able to wield their power over the MacSweeney, they then have the access to that broader maritime world. So what is happening in this area is the principal commodity is salmon, and to a lesser extent, herring. And if you think about salmon, if there are any fishers in the virtual room, you're not you're not fishing in the sea for them. Obviously, you need to understand their habits and their practices and where they go to spawn. And so it involves a certain amount of coordination and organization and involvement of people who are upstream in order to capture the salmon, during the annual salmon runs, and then the ability of the lordships to control and organize how those salmon are dried and marketed. And the marketing is potentially going quite far. Scotland is obviously the first step and the connection, but Scotland and Scotland's maritime world is also connected to the much broader North Atlantic. So we can think about the involvement of Irish maritime lordships essentially in the same kinds of activities that are happening around Iceland. Okay, and Iceland is obviously a very important place from the Hanseatic League and beyond in terms of the fishing stations. And this is a very significant fishing station that we're looking at here, but it may not look like one. So it was in the 16th century. So the kinds of patterns that we see in Iceland are probably very similar to what we're beginning to see in Ireland. So you have, fish being caught, prepared, stored locally, and then essentially being bartered and traded with ships coming in for goods. So it isn't all necessarily a cash economy. Those fees being charged in West Cork by the O'Driscolls and the O'Sullivan Bear may have been in kind as much as in cash. But the point is that this is a very wide world. It's a very connected world. It's a very entangled world. Finally, just down to the southeast, this is a part of Ireland which remained heavily dominated by the Old English. So there's long-standing trade connections, certainly with English ports. But one of the things that's quite interesting in looking at the 16th century, coming out of the research, particularly by Susan Flavin, looking at the Bristol port books, what are people actually, what's being imported into Ireland? What do people desire? What are they trying to purchase? And then where is it going in terms of the interior movement? And a lot of the insights from her research suggests a very strong interest in expensive exotic stuff, things like Venetian glass and a lot of luxury fabrics. So what you see is an Irish world, both Old English and Gaelic, that is connected to continental fashions and by extension, obviously, continental politics, economics, outlooks. Okay. And I'm kind of stressing that point because what we see as the English are attempting to strengthen their hold over Ireland is a presentation of the Irish as somehow very backward, static, archaic people, or as Barnaby Rich would have it, sluttish and unclean and rude and loathsome. Lacking civility, humanity, or any manner of decency, which is a bit of a contradiction to what the archaeology and the port books are suggesting. And this is a very familiar process that happens in every area, under the forces of colonialism one way or another. This is a process of othering. And this is also where I think some people have fallen into the trap of seeing an equation between the Irish and Native people in the Americas, because the same language is used in both places. Just because the same language is used in both places does not mean that those descriptions are at all accurate anywhere that they are applied. But they were being applied about the Irish as a way of making them look distinct and obviously not as good as the English. This happens to the Old English as well, as you can see from Spencer's words about the Old English. In some ways, he thinks they're even worse than the Wild Irish, of course, being the Gaels. Now, Edmund Spencer is not exactly an unbiased witness here when he's describing his neighbors, because he acquired lands as part of the Ulster Plantation, so one of those 16th century efforts to colonize. What you see is his castle there, Kilcolman Castle. And I think somewhat tellingly, or at least it's worth looking at more closely, Spencer is obviously very anti-Irish, very anti-Old English, but yet he chooses for the center of his plantation an already existent tower house. So he's not building, a brand new forward-looking English manor house. He's re-edifying something that worked quite well on the ground and also projected a certain cultural understanding on that landscape. Spencer was a short-lived colonist, and when the Ulster Plantation was attacked and essentially failed towards the end of the 16th century, his castle was damaged and destroyed, and he kind of gave up. But anyway, more on Spencer another time. So the various efforts to cajole, convert, and to plant don't work. And as I mentioned at the start, it devolves into all-out warfare. And one of the things about the warfare in Ireland in this period is its brutality. And at times perceived at least to be much more brutal than in other places in Europe at the time. And one of the sort of storied proponents of that brutality is Sir Humphrey Gilbert, who is a familiar name to people looking at Elizabethan Atlantic expansion, famed for his various treatises, famed for his efforts in, well, he's on the Newfoundland stamp, right? So, you can pull that story together. But he also served in the military in Ireland, as did many other New World adventurers. And one of his sort of party pieces to frighten his enemies was, in beheading the vanquished, but then also lining the heads up on the way to his tent. So anyone coming as a supplicant would walk past those heads. And that raised a few eyebrows even in London as exceptionally harsh. So I said I wouldn't spend much time on the North American side of the Atlantic, but I do need to make one very quick stop at Roanoke. So another servitor, English servitor in Ireland was Sir Ralph Lane. He didn't actually spend much time in Ireland before heading over in 1585 to, charged with landing a colony on Roanoke Island off the North Carolina coast. Ralph Lane was not a particularly successful leader in this. After a year, essentially he and what was left of the colony had to be rescued by Sir Francis Drake. And one of the interesting elements about Lane's experience, he's sort of been interpreted as a failure because he was too martial, and he and the colony were reliant on the Roanoke Indians, but yet were very aggressive towards them, and the inevitable occurred. But the inevitable occurred at the hands of an Irish servant of Ralph Lane's, who actually beheaded Pomisipan, who was the Roanoke leader, and that precipitated the end of the Roanoke colony. So Lane is mostly remembered for the Roanoke associations, at least when you look in the Dictionary of American National Biography, and they don't say much about him after the failure of the colony, except that he ended up being the chief bell ringer of Belfast. It is actually true, that is one of the jobs that he got on return to Ireland, but he did a lot of other things as well. He never expressed any interest on returning to Ireland. I didn't mention the quote at the top of the slide there, which is Richard Hakluyt's estimation of New World colonization. If this doesn't sort of put the end to that idea of English successfully colonizing in Ireland, then heading to North America, I don't know what does. Not that it's accurate in and of itself. So the idea that somehow it will be much easier to conquer the native people of the Americas than it was in Ireland. So Ralph Lane limps back across the Atlantic, and he sets himself up in Ulster. He sets himself up in another re-edified tower house. This is at Ringhatty in County Down on the shores of Strangford Lough. And he decides to basically spend the rest of his life setting himself up as a colonist, first and foremost, but also he recognizes the centrality of that maritime economy that we've been talking about. And so in a letter which he sends to Robert Cecil in 1602, when he's looking for various and sundry other concessions, but he is singing the praises of his lands and also of the fish that he's going to catch and all of the people that he's going to bring in. This is the full version of the map that was in the background there. This is in the National Maritime Museum. It's catalogued as Map of East Ulster, but it's almost undoubtedly commissioned by Ralph Lane. And it is very interesting. We could spend hours just looking at what he has depicted on here. It wasn't his hand doing it, but he commissioned it. It's my belief because of, he describes it very closely in a letter he sends to Cecil. So you can see, hopefully, if you just look at the sea, the various different ships that he depicts. So we have galleys as well as English vessels. You can see the fish, the sea is teeming with fish. And of course, presenting the north of Ulster is also having a lot of other commodities, principally woodland. So there's a lot else going on in this map, but I think I better move on from it. In thinking about Lane in his Tower House, and Spencer to some extent in his Tower House, and a lot of other incoming English servitors who seem to be very interested in adopting Gaelic customs while at the same time criticizing them, it's made me think a lot about mimesis. When we think about mimesis, we usually think about the way that a colonized other, if you like, utilizes and mimics the actions and habits of those in power, but it goes the other way as well. Some of that is a way of demonstrating power, but there's also at some level something genuine in it. And that's what I want to explore a little bit. I'm not going to explore too much about Thomas Lee's amazing portrait there. It's an extremely stylized version of Irish soldiers' clothing, so stylized it's hard to even see the resemblance. But he is someone who in his writings is clearly admiring of a lot of aspects of Irish life, even when he is leading English troops into combat. What I do want to talk a little bit more about, and this does come back to the adoption of tower houses, is the way that many English were quite attracted by Gaelic practices of hospitality. And hospitality is something that was actually deadly serious as a political strategy for the Gaelic elite. What you have in your individual lordships, the way that lord demonstrates their power is not through a lot of material goods necessarily, not through a beautiful building, but through the abundance of their hospitality. So the more that they can give you, present you with, feed you with, give you to drink, entertain you with music, poetry, the more they demonstrate their importance and their power. But that requires the work of the bards, the hereditary poets that were attached to every lordship. So you get a flavor of the poetry of O'Hagan there on the bottom of the screen, the right hand of the champion of Tara, never disdained, so his glass is constantly being filled with wine. And that is all to promote the power of the Maguire. One of my favorite narratives from this period comes from another servitor, Josias Bodley. And Bodley goes to visit another servitor, Sir Richard Morrison, who's taken over an Irish castle in Downpatrick in County Down. And it's a sort of a litany of consumption. It goes on for pages and pages about everything that he is given when he visits Morrison: tobacco, every kind of drink that exists, every kind of food that exists. They're entertained by Irish mummers. They go to look at St. Patrick's Well. They get the full treatment. And then Bodley writes it up. And everything in this letter suggests to me he's mimicking what he's read of the bards. It's not quite right. It's a copy. It isn't, it's not the real thing. But there's clearly an admiration here. In the same way that the top vessel there is a Gaelic mether, a multi-handed wooden vessel, which would have been passed around as part of a drinking ritual. And you can see that being mimicked through the use of an English tig. Okay, so we have a convergence here of certain practices, certain understandings of elite activities and generosity, if you like, but there's also a dissonance because they're not precisely the same. So I'm going to shift now and look at the Ulster Plantation. All right, so we've had 16th century background. The 17th century ushers in a very different environment. The Irish are militarily defeated quite roundly in 1601. 1607, we have what's known as the Flight of the Earls, which is effectively when the two most powerful Gaelic leaders in the north of Ireland, O'Neill and O'Donnell, leave. They leave to go to the continent to get more help to come back, but they don't return. So it leaves a power vacuum in the north of Ireland. And this is when I think we can really talk about a much more encompassing colonial effort. And so essentially the lands in the province of Ulster are divided up and given to different groups of people. So some goes to the church, some goes to individual undertakers, those who undertake to plant, and some actually goes to Irish as well. But the one I want to concentrate on the most is what becomes the county of Londonderry, which is granted to the London companies, the medieval merchant guilds of the City of London, who hold the purse strings. So they are required by the new King James to invest in this effort. Okay, they're not particularly interested, by the way, but they're compelled to invest their money. And the rules and regulations for the Londonderry Plantation are a bit different than those for the rest of Ulster. The Londonderry Plantation was, the geographical area is essentially the O'Cahan Lordship, not entirely, but mostly the O'Cahan Lordship, which was taken over. So when we think about the Ulster Plantation, there has been a historical trend, at least, to see this as a major watershed and major change. So if we look at the estimation of Philip Robinson, we have radical transformation of the landscape, innovation, hedged enclosure, urbanization, permanent dwellings, and so forth. This is, I have to say, an overstatement. We don't really see hedged enclosure in this part of Ireland really until the latter part of the 18th century. Okay, there is urbanization in that there are 16 new towns created, but not all of them are particularly successful nor large. So it is something of, as I said, an overstatement, but it's one that fits a particular historical narrative. Right, so these are the London Company lands. As I said, they don't want it, but they have to participate. They are given lands, which they choose by lot, and they are required to, first and foremost, remove all of the Irish from their lands. They are required to build villages and settlements, and those villages and settlements must deploy particularly English forms of architecture, so principally timber-framed houses. So that is the plan, and that is the requirement. And many of the companies, even though they weren't interested, they did do as they were told, in that they started to invest money and send people over. So if we just take one example, the Drapers Company, and I've been looking at the Drapers archives recently with help from the Drapers Company, for which I'm very grateful. Moneymore is the village that was constructed by the Drapers. So this is a new settlement, and you can see the ideologies in the street plan there. You know, grid plan, you've got stocks and a flagpole in the center, so civic authority at the top of the town. You have a fortified bawn or enclosure, and the castle and manor house, which is where obviously the settlement is going to be administered in a sort of remarkable continuity in some ways. The background photograph is the middle of the high street in Moneymore today, and the building at the top of the high street there is where the castle was. It is the current Orange Lodge. So you get the sense, at least from Moneymore and the Drapers' accounts, that they were trying to do everything they were supposed to do. There's a mill, for example, that they constructed. They actually also had a piped water supply. So there are some major changes there. Not all the companies managed to do that. So if we go to Mavanahar, which is the principal village of the Mercer's Company, they got the best lands actually on the river Bann, adjacent to fishing, so salmon and salmon weirs on the Bann. They've got proximity to the forest, but as you can see from the 1622 map, they haven't managed that regular street plan. It's all a bit higgledy-piggledy in the forest. This is one of the first sites that I excavated to do with Londonderry Plantation.
And it was 1998, so, you know, pre-digital photograph, so photograph is what it is. And I was very interested in finding evidence for that small little house there, which is very much of a vernacular Irish style. So not what was supposed to be in an English village. And we did find traces of it, and it was the artifacts associated with it included Ulster coarse pottery, which you can see there on the screen, not the most beautiful stuff, but very interesting, as well as the expected English wares. Since that time, you know, everywhere I look now, I can see that evidence for what I've termed material hybridities, where you have in these English settlements, the adoption of Irish material culture, particularly the pottery, which is significant, I think, because it's round bottom pottery, it's hand built, and you would use it in a very different way than you would a piece of North Devon. So it's suggesting a proximity of relations and a change in cultural practices. Similarly with architecture, there are Irish style dwellings popping up on every map of early settlements in the Ulster Plantation. And we also have it in some of the physical fabrics. So a 16th century example there in the background of the use of wicker centering in an English castle. And wicker centering is a particularly Gaelic practice where rather than a corbelled arch, you basically build a wickerwork framework and you pour your mortar and stones on top of that to create an arch. And that is indicative, obviously, of Irish masons building these structures. Again, I mentioned the numbers of Irish houses appearing on maps, Ulster Plantation maps. These are all London Company settlements, excuse me, with Irish style dwellings. And the clip in the middle is from some of the microfilm, I'm afraid, of the Drapers' records. Hugh Tarbert, his covenant for an Irish house and a small piece of land. So this is expressly forbidden, but yet it's also being documented. So there is obviously a willingness to live in an unfamiliar dwelling, but also to rely, obviously, on Irish builders. And because the Drapers' archive is really quite extensive, and they were very good at least for a while, noting their accounts, we can look at the account books and actually see what you're looking at here, that Irish laborers are being named and paid. So you can see, and we've got Patrick and Dermot and Donna and Turlock. So these are all the people who were supposed to be removed from the Drapers' lands, and instead they're clearly quite central to that plantation effort. I'm not suggesting they want it to be, but they are part of that fabric and that daily life. In terms of fabric and daily life and thinking of hybridities, this is, I'll try not to spend too much time on this, but it is really probably one of the best examples of hybridity and ambiguity that I know of. And this is a set of clothing that was found in a bog in the late 1950s outside of Dungiven. And it's in the collections of the National Museum, Northern Ireland, and I was able to spend some time with it a few years back. And what you have in essence is a set of elements that index multiple identities. So you have a very Gaelic Irish mantle or cloak. You have an English style doublet, quite fitted fashion. You have a pair of trews, which are made out of a tartan fabric, which is actually likely to have a Highland origin or connection at least. And you have leather shoes that are using two different techniques of construction, Irish and English. So all of these things worn together could have been quite confusing to anyone viewing the wearer in trying to work out what their identity was. And I think that is salutary. I can't tell you who wore it and who probably died wearing it going into the bog, but certainly it's suggestive of the proximity, but also, again, that ambiguity. You would, if you saw this person, you would probably connect with whatever you are most familiar with in trying to engage with that individual, but you could have been quite wrong. Similarly, I've begun looking at collections that were excavated in the 1970s and 1980s in the city of Derry, Londonderry. And these are excavations that took place very rapidly in the wake of terrorist bombing campaigns. So one of the sites I've been looking at is essentially the ditch on the far side of the town wall. You can see Derry's tremendous walls there in the background. And some of the items coming out of that ditch or maybe a bit surprising, it's not a small village. This is the major settlement for the London companies. And here again, we see that sort of hybrid practice on shoes. So suggestive that craftspeople are actually talking to one another and changing their practices. And that to me seems significant. Leather is my sort of segue to thinking about cattle again, because the cattle economy that was so decried in the 16th century by English commentators as backward, nomads running after the cows, as far as I can tell, readily adopted by incoming planters, and in fact becomes very central to the plantation economy. Not in so many words necessarily, but in parsing through the documents and some of the sites, there continues to be a reliance on cattle as a major export and a plank for the economy, in the same way that the maritime economy is being expanded. I find it quite interesting as well in thinking about the cattle economy, that one of the major planters, Scottish planter coming in, Sir Claude Hamilton, he is actually taking rents from his tenants in cattle, which is exactly what those tenants, who are almost undoubtedly the same ones who were on the lands when it wasn't Claude Hamilton in the castle, would have been providing. So for people at the bottom end of the scale, who they're paying their rent to may have changed, but how they were paying it and certainly some aspects of their lives may not have changed all that significantly at all. They're still, at the bottom of a hierarchy. So coming back to Moneymore, all was not as it seemed on that nice 1622 image because of what one of the agents was getting up to. And basically, Agent Russell was accused by a number of the tenants of building a great and unnecessary brew house. He diverted the town's piped water supply to his brew house. And he also took up the leases in a number of the houses in the village and turned them into pubs. So this is smart on his part, because that is one way of recouping his own investment and making money. He's a good entrepreneur, but it also opens up a lot of questions about what was happening in those spaces and who is coming together to drink in these places. And I can guarantee you, by the low numbers of English who actually settled on the drapers' lands, that it's going to be a mixture of Irish, English, and Scots. This is obviously something that we can think about and track archaeologically, which is why it's a direction of research that I find quite compelling. These are just some of the objects coming out of the town ditch in Derry, which also obviously are suggestive of communal drinking practices. Susan Flavin, who I mentioned earlier before, is leading up an ERC project right now called Food Cult. And one of the things that they've been looking at is a transformation in drinking practices in Ireland in this period. And some of that is the move from more traditional Irish drinks, including ushkaba or whiskey, into the adoption of beer in particular. So if you're interested in the reconstruction of a brew house and a late 16th century Irish recipe for beer, go and have a look. But I put this in here just to note, again, this is something that is changing. It's dynamic, but it's being adopted and shifted on for everybody involved on the landscape. Ale houses were a subject of some concern to the English crown and to some of the individual servitors. So you see various efforts to limit ale houses and limit brewing. These were totally ineffective, as you might imagine, because this was a way, again, of making money, and it's a commodity that everybody wanted. It's obviously something that still goes on illicitly. I will not give you the location of that still that you see on the screen, because my life depends on it. Ale houses also bring me into, I'm getting towards wrapping up here, but I need to have a brief conversation about religion and religious identity when we think about Ireland and the broader scope of colonialism, because the Ulster Plantation was also supposed to be a Protestant plantation. Okay, so in addition to removing the Irish from the lands of the London Company lands, they were also supposed to ensure the conversion elsewhere in the Ulster Plantation. So William Lithgow, the Scottish traveller, was not impressed, as you may see. He was not impressed by the very few Protestant churchmen who actually went to Ulster, describing their alehouse, the alehouse as their church and their Irish priests as their consorts. Churches were being built. Some of the companies did build churches. Some of them re-edified medieval houses of worship. Some of them just didn't get around to it. And as we can see from the complaints of Sir Thomas Phillips, there were plenty of priests in the plantation as well as friars who would move around the landscape. And actually, I think it's 7 of the London companies built mass houses on their lands. And that includes the drapers. Okay, so not exactly following the rules, but following the realities. Quick scoot back across the ocean. Of course, Catholicism was not something that just happened in secret in the Ulster Plantation. There's also obviously archaeological evidence of it from Jamestown, which is really not exactly highlighted in documentary record. So the last company settlement that I want to look at, particularly in relation to this question of religious identity and changing identities, is that of the Skinners. And the Skinners Company devolved a lot of their works to their agent, Edward Doddington. And Doddington decided to set up the principal fortified settlement for the Skinners at Dungiven. And Dungiven was an important O'Cahan site. There you can see on the Raven drawing there, there's a tower house, which is the O'Cahan Tower House, which is appended to a priory for which the O'Cahans were the patrons and had been through the medieval period. So Doddington builds his manor house up next to the tower house and fortifies it with something of a bond. None of that survives. Doddington's works don't survive above ground now. They've been found archaeologically, but what you see when you go to the site today is just the priory building. So that plantation history has in fact been erased. And in fact, before it was rediscovered by Nick Brannan and Brooke Blades, there was no understanding that this had any plantation history. So I've got the chancel marked there. So if you go to Dungiven Priory today, whoops, you don't go to Jamestown. If you go into the chancel, you will see a remarkably preserved 15th century effigy tomb. This is the kind of thing you would expect with the imposition of the Reformation in Ireland to have been destroyed or damaged, or at least hidden at the center of the Skinners Company holding. And that didn't happen. It is preserved. And the reasons for it being preserved, obviously open to interpretation, but it was a deliberate decision on Doddington's part. Doddington dies in 1618, but his wife continues to hold that land and to hold the center of the Skinners Company lands until she dies in, remarkably enough, 1670. And her strategy is pretty clear for maintaining that land, is that she obviously gets along with her neighbors very well indeed. Rent reports indicate dominance of native Irish on the lands, and of course the accusation that she didn't bring in any English and fostered Irish papists. Thinking about it archaeologically, I also find it very interesting that when you go to the site today and you walk along, the bottom of this rise, which is mostly graves, and you enter through the 17th century entrance, which on the map is up here. If you did that in the 17th century, you could go in here, you could go into the chancel, and you would never engage with the plantation side of the house, nor necessarily be seen by it. So it seems to be allowing a continuity of worship and practice and visit for the Irish in the area. Check my time here. Okay, all right. The last place we have to go, because everybody who goes to the north of Ireland has to go to Dunluce, brings us back to the McDonalds. And I mentioned them in connection with the Lordship of the Isles earlier. Ranald Aranach McSorley McDonald is probably one of the most interesting shapeshifters on the landscape in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. He is on the one hand a Highland Scot holding on to or trying to reestablish the Lordship of the Isles. He is Catholic. He becomes a very good friend of James I, obviously James VI of Scotland. He becomes the Earl of Antrim in 1620.
And we can see his sort of shifting identity through the architecture at Dunluce. So Dunluce was previously a McQuillan stronghold, which the McDonalds acquire. They build the gateway with classic Scottish corbelled turrets. But when McDonald becomes, in essence, an English planter, he builds an English-style manor house in the middle of the keep. He also builds a village and populates it as per plantation expectations with Protestant settlers and merchants. He builds a Protestant church, St. Cuthbert's, and he gives it the name of the Northumbrian saint. So he's doing all the things that he's expected to do, except that he also builds Bonamargee Friary back up, funnels money to the Franciscans for the Counter-Reformation, and he's ultimately buried at Bonamargee. So he's playing all sides of the house to his own benefit. If we look a little bit more closely at some of the recent excavations at Dunluce, directed by Colin Breen, you can see in the material culture both the sort of global connectivity of this site in the presence of Chinese porcelain, a wide range of continental and English imports, but you also see the enactment of Gaelic rituals, hospitality rituals with a harp tuning peg, more Ulster coarse pottery, and you know, but then I should mention also the Polish coin in terms of that wider economic connections, Dutch tiles. So Dunluce was actually a very central place at this point in time. And that comes as a big surprise often when we take people, you know, to look at the site today, because it's just hanging off the edge of a cliff in what is perceived to be a backward part of Ireland today. So those are really some of the stories of the Ulster Plantation and the kinds of transitions in identity and the role of material culture in brokering some of those transitions. I want to wrap up now by thinking about what happens next. It's basically, I've presented the 16th and early 17th century as a failure in the sense of all-encompassing plantation and colonialism. And that is true to a certain extent. You have effectively 30 years of uneasy peace in the first part of the 17th century because of the interreliance of incoming planters on the Irish who never leave. It changes at mid-century, and funny enough, it changes with the 1641 uprising. The 1641 rising stroke uprising was initially a small-scale effort led by Irish Catholic gentry to try to get just a little bit more power within the existing Irish Parliament, basically. And it devolves into outright warfare, and it devolves into something that gets sucked into the wider War of Three Kingdoms. At the end of all of that, things are radically different. And you can see that in the figures for the land holding that I've put up there. So 1641, 59% of lands are still held by Gaelic Irish, Old Irish Catholics. So that is that's a shift, obviously, from the 16th century, but it's still, a small majority. 1688, that's down to 22%. We get into the 18th century, of course, that shrinks even further. So we're looking at mid-century, the impact of Cromwellian resettlement and transplantation. And this is where I can connect back again to some of the Caribbean stories that previous speakers have been talking about, because this is, of course, the period that is well known for the transplantation of numbers of Irish natives to the Caribbean as indentured servants. Quite clearly, not everybody who went to the Caribbean from the island of Ireland was an indentured servant. There are, of course, also merchants, sailors, people who end up owning plantations and being involved in things like the transatlantic slave trade. But there is, of course, also that movement of servants, so people who were forced to leave against their will. Some of them would have spent time at the site in this image, which is on Inishbofin in County Galway. And this was a garrison, and it was a staging point for sending both priests and individuals who were captured by the Cromwellian forces and sending them across the Atlantic. Interestingly enough, it's a sort of site that is generally not, shall we say, greatly appreciated on the island of Ireland, but it is appreciated by the local community who want to do some work there. So I'm hoping maybe at some point in a few years' time to report back on that.
So that just takes me to note that no matter how colonial Ireland's history may have been, Ireland was also immersed in colonizing practices and the wider world of inequality in the Atlantic. And nowhere is this more equivalent or more obvious than in this engraving from 1780, which is celebrating the ability of Ireland to enter into free trade. Ireland had already been serving as a very important provisioning station. So goods going from places like Belfast, Cork butter, going to provision Caribbean plantations. 1780 opens up that landscape much more broadly to trade. It's evident archaeologically. I can see it in the materials coming out of Derry and the wealth of 18th century materials. You can see it if you on Dominica, because there were plantations called Londonderry and Belfast. You can see it very viscerally in some of the shipwrecks around the Irish coast in Dunmorley Bay in County Cork. The main shipwreck image there on the screen is 17th century ship involved in piracy and slaving, but there was also in 1701 the wreck of a Royal African Company ship, which went down in Dunmorley Bay with most of the individuals on board perishing. So I'll leave my comments with this image of that small, tiny little dot that is Ireland and a very large globe, just to make the point that in thinking about Ireland's history, it's not just a history relevant to England or 800 years of British oppression. Ireland was very much connected to that broader world that we've been talking about, but occupies an interesting and anomalous position as both a colony and a place that was involved in colonizing and colonial behavior and activities. So I hope that was of some interest moving northwards from where we've been, and I shall, I think, stop sharing my screen now. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. It was very wide-ranging talk, and but able to dig into some very exciting particulars. And I'm excited for this question and answer portion. My name is Joshua Fitzgerald, and I'll be facilitating the Q&A now. And just in case you haven't been on Zoom in the last 2 years, make sure that you go down and click on the reactions button and do raise your hand, the raise your hand feature. It'll pop up a little hand and I'll be able to call on you. Otherwise, you can send us here. We'll go and enable the chat feature so everyone can chat again. And you can send your questions directly to Oliver and I, and let us know if you'd like us to read out your question to you. But when you're called upon, please go ahead and turn your video feed on so that Professor Audrey Horning can interact with you and talk with you. And we'll go ahead and open up the floor for questions. We have about 22 minutes or so. We have more than enough time for a lot of questions. So, okay. Okay, John, Rob, would you like to please unmute yourself and ask your question?
Oh, yes. Audrey, thanks for a wonderful talk. That was really interesting. I was curious about kind of the follow through. One of the main things I took away from your talk was that the Ulster Plantation area wasn't a kind of sweep away all the people who lived there. It was a much more mixed thing with a lot of continuity as well, which is really interesting. I was sort of interested to know what happened to that when you got into things like the 18th century, because my familiarity with that comes from thinking about, say, the Scots-Irish in North America. And what you get from there is a kind of overwhelmingly Presbyterian, Scottish kind of storyline. So what I'm wondering is that storyline wrong? And that was actually much more mixed than we're led to believe? Or was that storyline right? And there was some kind of a purification in the later 17th and early 18th century, or a kind of ethnic cleansing or something?
Great question, and good to see you, John. Thank you for coming. The purification, I think, is purely in historical narrative. Or, you know, it's not even an archival purification. It's just an unwillingness to see what's actually in front of our faces. And one of the most obvious things is looking at place names
in the north of Ireland, and looking at family names. So, you know, I live on the lands associated with the Drapers Plantation. It's not why I'm looking at their archives, but it does make it handy for going out into the landscape. One of the major Irish families on the Drapers' lands were the O'Hagans, and they were very central clan, in particular their relationship to the O'Neills. And I go running every day, and I run past, you know, people's post boxes where they've got the name O'Hagan up, you know. So it's sort of it's a myth of the major movement. I'm not saying people didn't move, it didn't shift. What you see is a shift onto, to some extent, the worse lands, but not leaving altogether. So there is more, you know, continuity in terms of Gaelic Irish presence than certainly the historical narrative would lead us to believe. And then, you know, thinking about the Ulster Scots narrative, you know, you have in the latter part of the 17th century, so not the early part of the plantation, you do have large numbers coming in from lowland Scotland, but those are the folks who had the financial wherewithal in the 18th century, and they find themselves actually being discriminated against because they're not Church of England or Church of Ireland, they're not Anglican, so they're subject to the same restrictions as our Catholics. They can emigrate and they can go to North America and, you know, create another whole sort of interesting cultural identity in doing that. So yeah, there's a lot of strands in there.
So what you're suggesting then is also that there was kind of a filter, and that the people who ended up in North America weren't a kind of random or total representation of people in Ulster.
No, not at all. So I
Right.
mean, we do see a movement of Catholic Irish from the north of the island to North America, and that's also, it's a migration that's underplayed, I think, in terms of memory because of the dominance of the famine era migration. But you do have in the late 18th century, not the early 18th century, when we see the Ulster Scots moving, you do have some individuals who are going, you know, on small scale basis, and they become actually the ones. I've been doing some work in Lowell, Massachusetts, which is not part of today's talk, but you know, some of the Irish who end up in Lowell, Massachusetts before the time of the famine are part of that late 18th century movement of people who are, you know, they are strategic and entrepreneurial to a certain extent.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for that question. That was great. I just sort of following up with this concept, I'm wondering about, I guess it's actually a question about the reverse diasporic sort of events that might have taken place, and any of the exchanges that it went back in the other way, material culture that's coming back from the Americas that you've found in anything that's been sort of exciting that you've found in that regard.
One that I threw the slide out for interest of time, but now I get to put it back in. Not something that I found, but I find it very intriguing. Is there are obviously a number of Spanish Armada shipwrecks around the Irish coastline. And one of those, the Girona, which went down actually very close to Dunluce Castle. Some of the finds from that shipwreck are on display in the Ulster Museum, and it includes a number of Aztec goods. And so, you know, just that kind of physical connection to a very connected world at that time period. I think often, you know, that I mentioned this in connection with Dunluce, surprises people from here, that Ireland and particularly Northern Ireland could ever have been central to anything happening anywhere else, and particularly, you know, that long ago. So yeah, I think of those Aztec materials on the Girona shipwreck in terms of that connectivity.
Thank you. That's great. Oh, and I just want to read out, I mean, I'm sure you've seen the comment that Alessandra had to leave, but she was very excited about the connections you made with the Caribbean and the exchanges that took place. And okay, so now I'll go to, let's see here, Rachel Han, did you have your hand up first, I believe? And please unmute yourself.
There we go. Sorry, too busy lowering my hand. Thanks, Josh. Thank you, Audrey. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm looking at a lot of material in the National Museum of Ireland at the moment from the ethnographic collection. So it's a reverse of what you're doing at the moment, because I'm looking at what's coming in. But what I'm seeing as well is that there's with Madden, who was one of the sort of abolitionists in the 1830s and 40s. He went to Jamaica and he found family connections, he found cousins he didn't know about. And while he wasn't making object collections out in Jamaica when he was working for the abolitionary movement, when he went to Africa and worked on the West Coast, he did. And he gave sort of this material to the Royal Irish Academy and to the Trinity College in Dublin, the museum there. And these now ended up in the National Museum. But it's interesting that while he was collecting in Africa, I'm thinking it's more in terms of his collecting to sort of illustrate the report that he's making for Parliament on all of these bits on what's happening out in the slave settlements there. So it's really interesting what they're actually bringing back at this point. I haven't got a huge amount of Caribbean material coming back in until later. But again, it's all these families and it's this hidden history that isn't really sort of out there. It's just really difficult to track down. So it's really interesting to seeing how far back a lot of these sort of events and the much wider sort of world of the sort of Irish connections that I have. So yeah, thank you for that. It's fascinating.
No, it's really interesting. Yeah, the colonial collections in the National Museum and National Museum Northern Ireland. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to seeing where you're going with that and what gets publicized, because it is often forgotten about. And there's some very, very rich material. There's certainly Native American materials in the Ulster Museum, which is not necessarily the first place you think to look for them. If you can give me, indulge me in reflecting back on Ralph Lane, you know, I'd love to know what, if anything, he brought back with him from the Roanoke coastline. You know, obviously we have the white watercolors that are so famous, but did Lane have anything? He doesn't seem to have had any interest, as I said, in going back there at all, but it must have stuck with him. And one of his closest friends was Arthur Chichester, and Arthur Chichester was the Lord Deputy of Ireland, charged with implementing the Ulster Plantation. And Chichester actually sailed with Drake and was, on the voyage in which Drake died, and Hawkins as well. So Chichester had very bad memories of his one foray across the Atlantic. Just sort of picture them sitting at Ringhatty, which is a much more familiar kind of landscape and locale, grousing together about, you know, about the Americas and how much better things are going to be when they're fully in charge in Ireland.
Yeah. So I wonder where those collections ended up. Have you come across any in the other museums in terms of that physicality, or was it more in the archaeology?
In terms of Lane or that early period?
Early period, because I mean, I'm only very much looking at much later stuff. So Dublin Society is stuff coming in because obviously their museum was only founded sort of 1792. So it's a little bit late and it's taking time for stuff to come in.
I'm waiting for the day somebody finds that trunk in their attic, but but I'm not aware of any tangible material culture coming, into Ireland. I mean, again, this is the white watercolors, which are in the museum, but other than that, I don't know. The other early bits of Virginia materials are in the Ashmolean, which relate to the Powhatan's mantle, obviously, and there's a lovely leather pouch, but so many things were, traveling back across the Atlantic that are lost to us now, but I hope that they might turn up.
Fingers crossed.
Thank you for that question. Beatrice Marin Aguilera's got a question now. Please go ahead.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey, for such a wonderful talk. I have two questions. One is regarding discourses and the other one is regarding material culture. So the first one is that you were mentioning that the English were somehow using similar discourses when it comes to indigenous communities and the Irish. So do you have any information of how the Irish were referring to indigenous communities when they were on the other side of the Atlantic? That will be the first question. And the second one is, it was the leather shoe was really fascinating to see that they were using different techniques, both English and Irish, in their manufacture. So do you have something similar, for instance, when it comes to indigenous communities in the Atlantic, like a mixture of Irish techniques and indigenous ones, or something similar?
I think, let's start with the first in terms of Irish perceptions of Native people, we don't have their words. You know, if I'm thinking about 16th and early 17th century, which is a time frame that I focused on, you know, we've got reference to some Irish people like Edward Nugent, who was Lane's servant, who obviously committed murder, but we don't have anything that he wrote. There is evidence for, you know, some indentured Irish servants going into the Jamestown colony. We don't have what they wrote either. So I can't answer that. What would be interesting, I think one of the common statements that's often made by English commentators comparing the Irish and Native Americans has to do with houses again. So the second they encounter something that's not square, you know, that is sort of subrectangular with a central hearth, which is, you know, is one form of Irish house, and obviously very similar to, at least in plan, to Algonquian houses in Eastern Carolina and Virginia area, they draw that equation. Now, whether an Irish person would say, well, that looks like one of our houses, I don't know. I don't even know if that is necessarily relevant, if you know what I mean, especially given that the English were perfectly happy residing in those sorts of structures, even if they identified them wherever they were as Irish. Mm-hmm. And then in terms of hybridities, in terms of clothing on the native side, I would, some of the more interesting things that I've seen, work that's been done looking at the Delaware area. So looking at Swedish and Dutch colony and looking at the ways in which the Lenni Lenape people are, you know, they are taking some aspects of the European clothes that are gifted to them and, you know, changing them in their own, you know, to their own preference, and changing the meaning of that clothing. And it's something that Diana Lauren has written about for other, you know, for the 18th century Louisiana and other parts of the colonial Americas. So yeah, hybrid clothing is a really powerful element of material culture, you know, at least in terms of sparking our imaginations in trying to understand the changing meanings in the past.
Yeah, I know about the 18th century, but the 16th century and 17th is always a little bit more complicated.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Thank you for that question. That was great. It reminds me of what's happening with families that are converting in Mesoamerica or in 16th and 17th century Mexico, and the ways in which people have wills and testaments. They're leaving things to their daughters, their sons, and you can track sort of ways, ambiguities and identities in the types of clothing items that they're passing along and how they might be identifying with that type of material culture, but nothing that's that we're able to actually find the physical sort of. So other questions that have cropped up? Teresa Singleton has a question. Yeah, please go ahead and unmute yourself and then.
No. Hi, Audrey. Yeah, I really enjoyed your talk. This is sort of, I don't know if you would know about this, but now Galway's in Ireland was an actual colony, but the name does show up on plantations in the Caribbean. I'm thinking particularly Montserrat.
Yeah.
And I guess my question was, but I didn't think that Montserrat had a Irish own, you know, the planter, the owner. I don't think that there were definitely Irish indentures at Montserrat when the plantation was first established, but I don't think the owner was Irish. And so I guess I was wondering if you knew anything about that, and you know, whether I guess I'm thinking of sometimes the actual laborers had some role in what these plantations, the names these plantations end up becoming. And so anyway, I just thought maybe you may have some comments on that.
Yeah, I don't know the specific answer to Galway's plantation. I've certainly, you know, it's a familiar name from Montserrat. My my gut feeling, as much as I would like to think that the laborers had the agency in naming it, is that there probably is a connection with the owner. When I think about, I mentioned Londonderry, Belfast plantations, and Dominica, so those are only two. And I think the more that historians have been looking into the role of Ireland in the Caribbean, the clear is there's an awful lot of Irish capital and Irish elites who are and were long on the ground there. And again, it's one of those, the historical story that gets emphasis is the one of the indentured servants, because it is a very compelling story.
Right.
And it's certainly more compelling, to any of us with Irish heritage thinking about, Irish people in the Caribbean. It's nicer to think about, an indentured servant working hard than all the connections to the people oppressing other people. But it just seems so clear that so much Irish capital and Irish individuals are very much entangled. And even, I mentioned very briefly the butter trade out of Cork. All of the provisioning, a lot of things coming from the wider landscape. Belfast shipping industry itself, the origins of the Titanic has roots, in the ships that are being built to service the transatlantic slave trade and all of the other transatlantic trade. So it's everywhere. So yeah, now I'm going to go and look up.
I haven't. I actually worked at Galway's with Matt Goodwin and Lydia Pulsifer. That was sort of my introduction to the Caribbean archaeology, and but I never knew whether I guess I always assumed that the planter had been English and not Irish, but it did have that Irish, the plantation did have this Irish name. And the only other example I know of that where a plantation was named by at least actually a plantation I'm interested in the Dominican Republic, it has an African name and has had it since at least the early part of the in the 1809 map, it has that name, and that's what it's known by today. And so I guess I was just thinking in terms of whether the workers had the indentured servants had some role in naming it Galway's. But anyway, I guess it's possible that the owner was actually Irish. But the first laborers at Galway's were indentured Irish servants. Yeah.
But I want to see that as the answer, and it is plausible in the sense that they probably would have been, because the nature of transplantation going out of Galway is quite likely in terms of an embarkation point. So if they just got the term of those Galways, I could see it turning into Galway's plantation. So, until proven otherwise, let's go with that. I like it. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank you. Let's see. We have time for one more quick question. I just wanted to make sure everybody knew to go ahead and register for the last meeting we'll have next week, welcoming Matthew Johnson to speak for the Garrod, to round out the Garrod's series, and Teresa will be able to give some comments on the structure of the series and some of the thoughts we had. It was wonderful during this talk, Audrey, to have you reference the speakers throughout the talk. It was fantastic to see the connections, shipping connections come out very clearly. Any other final comments or questions before we round out today's meeting? Let's go ahead and one more round of applause for Professor Audrey Horting, for this wonderful talk. It's really wonderful to have you with us. And I'll go ahead and make sure to look for that announcement for the next talk. And thank you all so much for coming to this today's meeting.
Thank you.